The kettle chimed softly in the corner of the loft, steam curling into the air as Eliza Monroe pressed the shutter of her camera one last time. The warm blink of the flash bounced off the brick wall of her studio, catching the soft folds of the vintage silk gown she'd chosen for the Monroe family reunion. The photo shimmered on her screen, her hair elegantly pinned, the satin catching a golden glow from the late afternoon sun. She looked radiant. But who would see it? Eliza sighed, lowering the camera. The quiet hum of the bookstore below lulled against the ache in her chest, the one that always returned this time of year. She poured herself a mug of tea and walked to the window, looking out at the cobblestone street where children danced in chalk scribbled hopscotch. She smiled faintly. This town had saved her. It had unexpectedly become family. Still, nothing replaced the longing that curled inside when she thought of her real family, especially her mother, Catherine. Growing up in the Monroe estate had felt like living within a glass frame. Everything gleamed, everything looked perfect, but it came with rules. Walk softly, speak with grace, and above all, never be too much. Eliza, with her spiral curls, hearty laugh, and growing figure, had been labeled too much early on. She'd spent years trying to shrink herself, her voice, her creativity, her body. Her mother's backhanded compliments at dinners, that dress is brave and you've always taken up space in your own way, echoed faintly in old family videos. The camera would pan past Catherine and Bianca, glowing under chandeliers, while Eliza stood half-cropped at the edge of the frame. If she was even in it at all. By her early 20s, Eliza had stopped begging to be seen and carved out space where she could breathe. Her photography wasn't just art, it was therapy. Her studio walls displayed powerful portraits of men, women, and non-binary individuals who'd been told for too long that they weren't enough. In their faces, Eliza found her purpose. Still, when the cream-colored envelope had arrived with the invitation embossed in gold, Monroe Family Portrait and Reunion, Heritage Garden, her heart had fluttered. Maybe this was a turning point. Maybe 14 years of subtle exclusion would finally shift. She'd bought the gown with care, tailored it to perfection. She'd framed it all in hope. Because despite everything, a sliver of her still wanted to belong, just once, to a photo that said, "I am here too." But that hope would shatter before sunset. Years of being invisible were about to be confirmed. With clarity, Teachy town of Marrowfield lay nestled between rolling English hills and fog-kissed meadows, a quiet, picturesque place where stone cottages stood proud with ivy-clung faces and neighbors knew each other by scent and smile. It was the sort of place where secrets, though they lingered behind lace curtains, rarely stirred the peace. And in that harmony, Eliza Monroe had carved her O.W.N. corner of truth, one photograph at a time. Above the hollow oak bookshop, tucked behind a low wooden staircase framed with fairy lights, Eliza's loft was more than just a home. It was a sanctuary. The ceiling sloped gently with the age of the building, and exposed beams bore the stories of decades past. Along the walls hung portraits, bold, genuine, full of color and skin and lived experience. Smiles that reached the eyes. Wrinkles celebrated instead of hidden. A gallery of real people caught in moments too honest for magazines. Eliza moved softly across the creaking floors, her bare feet brushing well-worn rugs. A kettle simmered on the stove, lavender steam curling around her as she stood in the middle of her cozy, cluttered kitchen. The smell of Earl Grey mingled with crushed rose petals as she reached for her favorite mug, a chipped ceramic thing painted with sunflowers. It was here, in Marrowfield, that Eliza had found what she only ever imagined as a child back in the Monroe estate: belonging. Her clients came from all walks: teachers, farmers, musicians, spoken-word poets. People came to her not to be polished, but to be seen, and they saw her too. On Wednesdays, she hosted Frames of Truth nights in her studio, where local artists gathered to share stories through image and sound. On Sunday mornings, Kat would bring pastries, and they'd sit cross-legged on Eliza's balcony, trading dreams and revisiting old wounds with the kind of resilience that only grew from shared healing. Yet even amidst the warmth, a quiet ache lingered. Her childhood home, the expansive Monroe estate, sat just 20 miles away, but might as well have been another continent. There, perfection still reigned. Legacy stood like an iron gate between Eliza and that version of home. But here in the layered from scratch beauty of Marrowfield, she was not the outcast or complication. She was the artist, the witness, the lens. And despite everything else, each time Eliza stood behind her camera and heard someone whisper, "I've never felt beautiful until now," she knew this was not only where her heart lived. It was where it led others home. The estate looked just as pristine as Eliza remembered. Manicured hedges framing the circular stone driveway, white doves curiously perched along the fountain rim. Every detail screamed curated perfection, like a porcelain dollhouse where real people weren't supposed to breathe. She stepped out of her beetle green car, smoothing the folds of her custom-made gown, sapphire satin, ruched at the waist, hugging her curves with quiet defiance. She had spent weeks designing it with a local dressmaker, something elegant yet bold. A statement without shouting. As she walked toward the entrance, familiar nerves coiled in her spine. Family reunions had always been a theater of criticism masquerading as civility. This year, she thought, might finally be different. She had grown, thrived, even. She was no longer the girl hiding fro. Her reflection. She was the woman behind the lens with a blooming business, a chosen family in her town, and pride in places her childhood had taught her to feel shame. Inside, laughter echoed from the sunroom. Crystal glasses clinked, and the smell of rosemary and burnished wood filled the air. Eliza paused briefly at the threshold, catching her breath. "Eliza," Bianca's voice called out, too sweet. "Glad you made it." Wearing an eggshell suit that probably cost more than Eliza's rent, Bianca walked over, all precision smiles and calculated warmth. "You look colorful," Bianca said, eyeing the sapphire dress like it had personally offended her sensibilities. "We already have a photographer, by the way." "Didn't I message you?" Eliza blinked. "No, I offered to bring my gear, I thought." Before she could finish, Bianca turned to greet another guest. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that Catherine pulled Eliza aside, her voice low like a purring cat. "Eliza, darling, thank you for coming. But the family portraits are about preserving who we are. Cleanly, respectfully." She reached out to pat Eliza's shoulder, missing completely. "We can't make room for distractions," she whispered. "These photos will last generations." Eliza stood frozen, her throat hot. "A distraction," she repeated softly. Her mother didn't respond, just smiled faintly and disappeared into the drawing room. That moment cracked something inside Eliza. It wasn't the insult, it was the final betrayal dressed in velvet politeness. For years, she had fought to belong, changed how she spoke, what she wore, where she lived. And still, it was never enough. She left before dessert, the golden hour light catching the shimmer on her dress as she walked away from the Monroe estate. No one followed. In her studio that night, Eliza stared at her reflection. She hadn't broken down, not yet. She uploaded the photos she'd taken of herself that morning, each frame a soft rebellion. And as the images came to life on the screen, Eliza felt the first spark of something deeper than anger. Resolve. The Monroe estate looked just as it always had, immaculate lawns, ivy-draped stone, and a silence too groomed to be called peaceful. Eliza sat in her car, already an outsider behind the wheel, fingertips tapping nervously on the steering. She'd rehearsed her arrival countless times. Dressed in soft sage silk, custom designed to flow like water and land with presence, she felt rooted, for once, like she belonged. Maybe this time would be different. Upon stepping into the entrance hall, she was greeted by glittering chandeliers and polished smiles. Her camera gear bumped gently against her hip, a symbol of contribution and purpose. She looked to her mother across the room. Catherine stood poised, perfectly styled, eyes scanning every inch of Eliza's appearance as though she were critiquing a painting in need of revision. No words of welcome came, just an appraising glance. Then laughter burst from AC. Ross the foyer. Bianca, effortlessly elegant in a navy sheath, strolled over with a glass of white wine and a familiar smirk. "Oh, didn't anyone tell you?" Bianca drawled, brushing non-existent dust from Eliza's shoulder. "They already hired someone for the photos. Mom said not to worry you, since you must be so busy with your little studio." Little studio? The phrase echoed louder than her sister's smile. Eliza blinked, unsteady for a second. That's strange. I was under the impression I'd be contributing. Bianca shrugged with carefully feigned innocence. Well, the photographer's already setting up outside. It was surgical, the way her presence was erased while her form remained in the room. Later, her mother pulled her aside as if offering something intimate. Her voice softened like velvet when wrapped around daggers. Eliza, sweetheart, Catherine began, you're beautiful in your own way. But these portraits, they're part of heritage. We want to present a certain refinement. You understand, don't you? We can't afford distractions. Distractions. That was her role. Eliza stood frozen, the smile on her lips trembling, shield over a growing rupture. Silence clamped around her throat. Her heart screamed, but her voice never came. She left before tears could betray her. No angry words, no dramatic exits. Just her shadow stepping off Monroe's soil, graceful, wounded, but intact. Alone in her studio that night, she pulled out her camera. Her dress shimmered softly under the warm, incandescent light. Removed from judgment, she posed before the lens, not like someone trying to fit in, but like someone finally seen. The shutter clicked softly, over and over, capturing her as she was, clear-eyed, luminous, and whole. In those stills, she met someone her family never chose to see. And in that quiet moment, Eliza knew belonging wasn't owed. It was chosen. And she would choose herself that studio lights were off, save for the soft glow spilling from her laptop screen. Eliza sat curled on the velvet couch with her knees pulled to her chest, still in the satin gown from earlier that day, its hem dusted with dried grass, its shimmer dulled by the weight of invisible sorrow. Her bare feet sank into the rug as she unlocked her tablet, her fingers trembling minimally with the aftermath of hurt. She scrolled through the self-portraits she'd taken that morning, long before the heartbreak settled in. There she was, radiant, confident, hands gently folded, eyes full of anticipation. She had posed with the same camera she'd brought to the reunion, still hopeful it would capture smiling faces and fragile steps toward healing. That hope had been punctured before noon. One image froze her. A close-up. Her eyes tender but strong, cornered by light, the hint of a tear reflecting like a star. That was who she was now. Not the version her family refuted, but this one. This woman carved from disappointment yet stitched together by purpose. Eliza looked around her. Studio, walls filled with portraits of people reclaiming their stories through her lens. Women of all shapes and shades standing unabashed. Men crying openly while holding family items long denied them. Children laughing with missing teeth, not airbrushed smiles. This room breathed with truth. A ping alerted her to a message. It was from Stacy, a caretaker from her childhood home, now in her 60s. The note reads simply, "Still remember the time you took your first photo with that sunflower crown? You belonged in every photo since. Let me know if you want to chat." Eliza smiled through a new wave of emotion. Maybe she hadn't been as invisible as she'd thought. Maybe parts of her had always existed in the margins, quietly acknowledged by those deemed unimportant by the Monroe legacy. She stood and approached her archival shelf. Dusting off one of her grandfather's old cameras, the one he'd gifted her before he passed, she held it like a relic of truth. He'd been one of the few to see her, not just look at her, but notice. He'd taught her that pictures tell stories words often silence. The air in the room shifted. Grief was still there, but beneath it, resolve was growing. Her reflection in the studio mirror wasn't a victim's, it was a storyteller's. Quiet, but not meek. Grieving, but not broken. Tonight, stirred by rejection, she wasn't planning revenge. She was creating something lasting. Something truthful. And they'd feel it, not through confrontation, but revelation. That Eliza sat alone in her cozy studio, warmth from the amber lights flickering across shelves filled with old cameras and coffee mugs etched with inspirational quotes. The photos from the Monroe estate still glowed on her tablet screen, each one a quiet protest against the narrative she'd been pushed out of. Her eyes lingered on her own image, regal, proud, soft, and fierce all at once in the gown she had chosen with such care. A different kind of legacy sat in her hands now, one that didn't need to be manufactured. That night, something shifted. She opened a leather-bound journal and scribbled the words the legacy uncovered at the top of a blank page. Beneath it, she wrote names, people she remembered from her childhood who had disappeared quietly. Nanny Margaret, who combed her curly hair at night. Her Uncle Harry, once a gentle presence at holidays, later whispered about as unfit. Eliza realized she wasn't the first to be erased from the Monroe family's polished portraits. She might just be the first to document it. She began reaching out privately, tapping into her professional network and using her reputation as a compassionate storyteller. Bit by bit, voices answered back. One by one, former Monroe Estate staff and extended family members agreed to meet, some cautiously, others gratefully. Their stories painted a vivid tapestry of truth that had never made it to gilded frames. Eliza used a converted room in her studio to conduct interviews against a neutral gray backdrop. The stories poured out of mistreatment, silence, favoritism, and pretense. And yet, also humanity, love in hidden moments. Strength under scrutiny. She photographed each subject, capturing them in dignified, personal light. These weren't pity portraits. They were testaments. Her friend Kat, a legal-savvy former client turned confidant, helped her navigate potential risks. They narrowed down which stories could be told freely and which needed careful framing. Every part of the project was constructed with intention, rooted in truth and compassion, not revenge. Simultaneously, Eliza created a visual timeline, beautifully haunting side-by-side comparisons of Monroe-approved photos versus their untold realities. She sent anonymous postcards, each stamped with captured moments, a servant's hand on a crying child's shoulder, Catherine caught mid-eye roll, and Eliza herself, radiant and powerful. As her collage of erased stories grew, so too did the momentum. Her community rallied behind her. Online forums of artists, activists, and body-positive creators began sharing her teaser images. A quiet thunder roared beneath the surface. Eliza wasn't tearing down a legacy. She was revealing what it was built upon. With trembling hands and determined eyes, she booked the gallery and gave her project its first breath of public air. The date was set. The lens now belonged to HER. Eliza sat cross-legged in the quiet of her studio, her soft dress pooling around her like spilled light across the hardwood floor. The room smelled faintly of rose tea and chemicals, whispers of film, truth, and time. Her laptop screen glowed with the raw images from her visit to the Monroe estate, each photograph a still moment containing echoes of pain and beauty. She scrolled slowly, pausing where the composition struck something deep. The way her hand gripped the wrought iron railing on the estate balcony, trembling but clenched with resolve. Her eyes in the photo, wide, luminous, defiant. Then, without intending to, she landed on a dust-covered image she'd screenshotted months ago from the Monroe Estate's public website. A sepia-toned photograph from 1950, grandparents, great-aunts, perfectly posed on the manor steps in press suits and solemn pearls. But if you looked closer, in the side mirror of a parked car behind them, a sliver of motion. A maid's figure, barely caught, looking toward the camera with a half-frown. Her presence not invited, merely leaked onto the final frame by accident. That was it. Her fingers hovered, then moved into a flow driven by instinct. She opened editing software. 2 browser tabs. A Word document. The legacy uncovered. She typed as a heading, her heart thudding faster with every letter. What if the best family portrait wasn't about symmetry or polish, but about what spilled out around the borders? Over the next few days, Eliza transformed her studio into something more than a workspace. It became a confessional, a sanctuary. She made calls, Jen. Ply approached contacts she remembered from childhood, nannies, drivers, cooks who had vanished quietly one day, never spoken of again. I remember the garden, said Mrs. Rowan, who used to bake fig tarts and sometimes slipped Eliza extra slices when no one looked. But I wasn't invited into the family photographs. Not once. It was like we were ghosts. Each interview became a photograph. Not just a captured image, but an artifact. Eliza took their portraits the same way she took her own, with reverence, with light. Their hands, their laugh lines, their truth. And as the gallery began to take shape in her mind, so did the idea of postcards, whispers sent home. Anonymous, but unmistakably Eliza. A photo of Catherine seated stiffly, caught seconds before telling Eliza to stay out of the shot. Another of the gold-framed hallway, except now with a mirror showing Eliza, present but unseen. She wasn't haunting them. She was revealing what had always been there. The ghosts were never out of frame. They were merely misfiled until NOWTG gallery smelled faintly of citrus and pinewood varnish. Eliza stood silently in the back as people gathered, their footsteps echoing across the halls like the ticking of long-held questions slowly being answered. Hanging on the walls were truths that had long been hidden behind silk curtains and gold-framed portraits, the real Monroe family, seen through Eliza's eyes. Each photograph was a revelation. A black and white image of the kitchen staff laughing in the back garden captured a joy rarely seen in official family records. Next to it, a portrait of an elderly groundskeeper. The man who had taught Eliza to ride her first bike smiled kindly beneath amber lighting. Beside him, a photo of Bianca at 16, furiously wiping tears off her face while their mother stood indifferent in the background. Not staged. Not polished. Real. When Catherine and Bianca arrived, fashionably late and comically overdressed, the atmosphere shifted. Whispers bloomed like wildfire among the guests. Catherine's heels tapped sharply as she walked, eyes scanning the exhibit with poorly concealed disdain. Bianca's smirk twisted the moment she noticed her own image, vulnerable and unguarded, staring back from the wall. "This is an invasion," Bianca muttered under her breath. Catherine's voice, deliberately low, trembled with unspent fury. How dare she make a mockery of our legacy? But their eyes kept moving, drawn by a haunting kind of gravity. The central piece came last. Eliza in her midnight blue gown, alone in the estate's garden, head tilted slightly, a single tear adorning her cheek like dew. Light wrapped around her like a secret she'd finally decided to share. Underneath the photo, the words delivered a quiet thunder. "Excluded but not forgotten, I left the frame. I became the lens." The crowd fell into reverent silence. There were no shouts. No dramatic confrontations. Just the heavy truth shifting the very air in the room. Guests began applauding, one hand clap at first, then a cascade of acclaim that filled the space with echoes older than Eliza's memories. Catherine gripped her purse tightly. Her perfectly curated mask began to crack, not from shame, but something deeper, realization. Bianca stood rigid, blinking faster than she could think, her image, her true self, now public and untouchable. Eliza never approached them. She simply stood on the upper level of the gallery, watching quietly. Not to gloat, not to hurt, but to finally be seen. Through the glass frames, years of silence shattered. And in their place, honesty gleamed. Invitations arrived not in envelopes, no embossed calligraphy or polished letterheads, but as stark, matte white cards with a singular photograph on the front. Catherine picked hers up from the breakfast table, lips pursed as she examined the image. A dimly lit corridor of the Monroe estate she knew all too well, only this time, the walls were adorned with photographs that did not belong to their official family canon. On the back, in exquisitely simple black print, it read, "You are cordially invited to The Legacy Uncovered, an exhibition of truth in portraiture. Saturday, 3 p.m., Glassbell Community Gallery." There was no sender's name. And it wasn't needed. Bianca spun the card between two fingers, scoffing. Seriously? She's having an art tantrum? Must be another one of her little indie projects. Catherine said nothing at first. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the photo again, recognizing the dusty corner shown in the image, long forgotten by the estate's curators but clearly familiar to someone who had once wandered unseen. "She's trying to make a statement," she finally said, her voice low and controlled. Bianca waved her hand dismissively. "Statement or not, no one's going to care. Besides, it's not like she can damage the family name with a few blurry snapshots." That afternoon, another parcel arrived. A delicate black envelope bearing a glossy 5x7 photo, Eliza, in full color, standing in the family garden in her reunion gown. Her arms gently folded, a soft, mysterious smile on her face. To Catherine, the image was hauntingly composed. She could see the elegance in Eliza's posture. A trained photographer's eye had crafted this. It wasn't rebellion, it was artistry. And it unsettled her. Something in the back of her mind stirred. A quiet alarm. Saturday came swiftly. Catherine debated not going. It wasn't a mandatory gala, after all. But curiosity, pride, and a vein of panic compelled her. She dressed in her best charcoal gray coat, pearls gleaming like tiny stars along her collar. Bianca wore a rigidly tailored navy pantsuit, high heels clicking like war drums as they entered the gallery. And then they saw it. The room was full. Not just locals, but media. Students, influencers, photographers. And the faces on the walls weren't the ones Catherine expected to see. There were nannies, cooks, gardeners, former Usins, and once shunned aunts. Contrasted directly beside pristine Monroe family portraits were truths, unfiltered, powerful, deeply human. Yet somehow dignified. She felt her stomach twist. And then she saw the final wall. Her own image, distorted mid-sneer, next to Eliza, still glowing, still proud. Not begging for space. Commanding it. It wasn't just an invitation to a gallery. Eliza had invited them to witness what they'd refused to. SETHE Gallery opened its doors while the late afternoon sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, casting golden streaks across the polished floor. Local residents, art enthusiasts, and curious visitors wandered in, murmuring in awe at the serene yet evocative atmosphere. Eliza stood near the entrance, dressed in a flowing navy blouse and emerald scarf, her camera slung gently around her neck. She had greeted a few close friends, but now she allowed herself to fade into the background, watching the reactions unfold. Large panels lined the walls, organizing the images into confronting pairings. One side presented Monroe family portraits from throughout the decades, smiling, polished, perfectly staged in front of ornate fireplaces and manicured lawns. Opposite them, Eliza's own lens presented raw, nuanced glimpses behind the facade, housekeepers gently wiping a child's tear, gardeners offering rides in wheelbarrows to laughter-struck cousins, relatives hidden from legacy photos yet fully alive in these rediscovered moments. Whispers spread as guests reached the next room. Here were interviews, printed excerpts beside expressive black and white close-ups. Former staff members, distant cousins, and once exiled in-laws shared quiet truths. Stories of being dismissed, of having identities trimmed away to maintain an illusion. Every voice, every gaze, added a thread to the tapestry Eliza had woven into being. Just before the final gallery wall, a simple white placard read, "Invisibility is more than absence. It is memory erasure." Then, the final image revealed itself. Bathed in soft golden hue stood Eliza, wearing the custom gown from the reunion, her face lifted gently toward the light. Her expression held a complexity, poised tethered to sorrow, quiet triumph edged with a trace of mourning. A tear traced her cheek, captured just before falling. Beneath the portrait, the caption read, "Excluded but not forgotten, I left the frame. I became the lens." There was a pause in the room, then soft applause. Unbeknownst to many guests, Catherine and Bianca had arrived moments ago, discreet but unmistakable in the doorway. Catherine's face tightened as the realization set in that those watching weren't mocking. It was admiration, compassion, inspiration. Bianca stared in stunned silence, jaw clenched, arms tense at her sides. Moments later, she turned and walked briskly out. Eliza glanced toward them, not to confront, but to acknowledge. It was enough. She didn't chase applause. The validation came not from Eng, but from truth echoed back to her. For the first time in years, Eliza didn't feel small. She felt whole. In the quiet that followed, she reached up and gently adjusted her camera strap. Still unseen by most, but deeply seen by herself. She had stepped out of their frame. But she created her own masterpiece. Eliza stood in the center of the gallery, heart pounding beneath her velvet blazer. The murmurs of the crowd swirled like soft echoes around her, mixing reverence and surprise. The air buzzed with the scent of fresh flowers and camera flashes. She had seen her portraits displayed before, fashion spreads, magazine covers, private commissions, but never like this. Never truthfully. Never completely. The wall ahead bore two sides. The Monroe family legacy, polished, traditional, curated to near sterility, and directly opposite, the Monroe family truth. Her display was powerful in its simplicity. Photos of generations of smiling Monroes with names, dates, and titles in polished plaques. But across from them were images uncropped, raw, quietly devastating. A nanny brushing young Bianca's hair. A cook with calloused hands serving holiday feasts. A distant cousin, openly gay, whose presence vanished from records after 2002. And then there were the moments Catherine and Bianca had never meant to share. Hidden frowns. Micro-expressions of disdain. A slip of exhaustion behind forced smiles. Eliza hadn't exaggerated anything. She had simply shown. Recorded. Shared the truth everyone else had silently lived beneath. The buzz in the room swelled as more visitors arrived, curious after seeing tags from viral posts and news coverage from the town's Arts Council. Phones were raised. Viewers whispered or wiped unexpected tears. At the far end of the room, a velvet drape had been pulled aside 10 minutes ago, revealing Eliza's final piece. A floor-to-ceiling portrait of herself, elegant and vulnerable. Her eyes fixed on that portrait now. It had taken every ounce of courage to include. It wasn't flawless. The light caught a glint of moisture at her lashes. Her shoulders were not rigid with defiance, but softened with acceptance. Her gaze, however, burned with something otherworldly. I left the frame. I became the lens. In the back, the gallery doors opened. Catherine entered, step hesitant under the weight of curious stares. Beside her, Bianca's expression flared with visible discomfort. Catherine stopped midway through the room. Her eyes caught the image of herself, caught mid-sentence, eyes sharp in judgment. Just below, a quote, "We can't have distractions." Next to it, a younger Eliza outside a family frame, half smiling, holding a camera too big for her hands. For once, no one spoke to them. No one flattered, praised, or asked for connections. The silence around the Monroes was louder than any applause. Catherine's gaze drifted to that final portrait. Her lips parted, but no apology came. Just stillness. Eliza took a slow breath and turned off. Not out of spite, but to greet a visitor wiping away tears. A former worker from the estate hugged her, whispering, "Thank you for reminding them we were never invisible." And in that moment, Eliza knew. Justice wasn't a wrecking ball. It was a mirror. Eliza stood in the hushed glow of the gallery, barefoot on the smooth concrete floor, surrounded by walls soaked in stories that existed long before anyone had dared to tell them. The air smelled of fresh canvas and lavender oil. Someone had placed a diffuser near the entrance. She liked that. A small piece layered over generations of unrest. She hadn't expected it to feel like this, not triumphant, not vengeful, but quiet. Almost sacred. Each photograph was a hymn, a whispered testimony from the shadows of the Monroe estate. Faces long dismissed as irrelevant now held space in gold frames. Smiling groundskeepers with dirt under their nails. A nanny tucking in Bianca during a thunderstorm. A handwritten note from her Aunt Grace, who vanished from family gatherings after marrying outside her race. It was all here, the forgotten love, the hidden pain, the truth they buried to keep their legacy polished. And weaved within every frame, Eliza's voice. She didn't hide behind the camera tonight. Near the end of the exhibit, just beside the exit, stood a single photo, her. Alone, strong, vulnerable, and absolutely unashamed. Earlier that morning, Eliza had stood before her mirror in that same gown, the soft purple fabric hugging her like a second skin. She wasn't trying to look smaller tonight. She wasn't apologizing for the space she took up. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see what her mother had always criticized. She saw someone who had survived cruelty without losing compassion. Guests moved slowly through the gallery, some wiping away tears, others snapping photos. A journalist from a national paper asked for a quote. Eliza simply said, "Truth is healing." Sometimes not for the ones who told the lie, but for the ones who lived under it. When Catherine and Bianca arrived, a hush spread through the room like mist over a lawn. They walked through the first two galleries, stiff as portraits themselves, uncertain, bracing. But when Catherine turned the corner and came face to face with her own candid expressions, judgment, impatience, discomfort, framed beside images of Eliza's kindness and quiet strength, something shifted behind her eyes. But Eliza didn't approach them. She wasn't there for penance or permission. She was there to witness the moment she stopped asking for their acceptance. That night, back in her loft, she curled on the couch with tea in hand and soft music humming. Her inbox buzzed with messages, some from strangers, some from estranged family. One stood out. Her father's message was gentle, unsure, asking if maybe they could meet. No talk of the past, just coffee, sometime. Eliza smiled as she looked out into the night. She had not forced the story open. She had become the story's lens.